I mean, as Kate said, this is in many ways a kind of a dry run, and as you can see, there are lots of people here who have interests in all sorts of ways in this, and so, you know, this is at least a chance to have a conversation about what we've just seen, but also about process in general. This method, which we're kind of sidling up to, is called the Lerman method, and it's critical response process. And there are 4 clear steps. I suspect that the 4th one is perhaps not the one that we will necessarily engage fully with this time, which I'll get to in a minute. The first step is a chance, and I think I'll handle it so that it's a chance for everybody to respond in a way, what's been interesting, what's been stimulating, just a quick touching base about what we've seen, any aspect of what you've seen, or perhaps if you're the maker, your point of view, where you're coming from and what that was like for you. Boof, 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 we'll go around. That's the first thing to kind of set the scene. The second bit, Nancy, Nicola and Kate have agreed to put to us, the panel, questions or thoughts that they might have about the process, their own processes, about how things went today, perhaps notions of how we might see things, what happens beyond this space in the future, etc. So there's a chance for then us to respond that way, and that's the second step. And then the third step is the panelists here, the respondents, the audience members, then have a chance to ask questions and explore things of our own that occurred to us as we were watching. And one thing that occurred to me as I was reading about this is that somewhere in between the second stage, in other words, the people asking questions about their own work, and the third one, where we might be responding and panel members to our own thoughts, actually I think we'll take notes and all feed off each other. So I suspect that stages 2 and 3 might overlap quite a bit as we proceed. In the Lerman method, in the 4th step, what then we do is then offer permissive opinions. I'm alert to the fact that this particular project is already on its feet and that it is developed, it's moving forward, it has its premiere next week, and I'm extremely alert to the fact that nobody has any interest in doing any derailing. So we, you know, we can't come in and say, oh, let's make sure that, you know, he doesn't wear grey. You know, no. Why does he wear grey? As Rachel says, the question there is, why does he wear grey? You know, but the opinion offering of, I don't think he should be wearing grey, is not the good direction we can go down in this situation. Actually, it's not the most interesting way to go anyway. So, let's go around, and I'll go the other way this time. Just a line or two in terms of initial response. What did you find interesting, stimulating, meaningful, moving? Anything about just the experience of the last couple hours?
I just wanted to say how much I thought it was just a very beautiful work, and the way that it captured those aspects of the harmonic language of the Japanese instruments, but then brought it into different ways. It felt as if there was a centre there within those Japanese instruments, of which it actually went away from and then it came back. So the whole feel of each scene felt as if it sort of opened out and then condensed. And that was something I thought was in the music, which I really enjoyed. But I felt that was also the thing about the libretti. It allowed that space for you to be on a journey, but also to have certain aspects of humour, certain aspects of deep emotion. Yes, I thought it would work beautifully. So, thank you.
I didn't think that I was there for just over an hour. It felt like I was there for a quarter of an hour or so. I was really captivated by the fusion of, by the synergy of all the elements. But the passage of time, I wasn't aware of, and being there for an hour. It was really special.
I really enjoyed the kind of formal shaping of the small parts, moving in a kind of arc. I wrote down I would travel across that road at about halfway through, leading to the incredible dream intensity of it, because I love that rise and fall. But when I say fall at the end, I enjoyed the silence. I'm sure there's a technical word, I'm not a musicologist, but the music just literally disappearing at the end, and I was absolutely spellbound. It was one of the times I wasn't sure to clap. You know, I just wanted to sit there for a moment and appreciate it.
You might want to get specific, I don't know. You're coming in a very different direction, aren't you?
Yeah. An incredible journey when I, from first meeting Nancy and Nicola when we spoke about this way last year. And it's glad, for me, I'm a storyteller, I'm just glad the story makes sense. But for me, it's got space to grow. And my main objective was the fusion of all the elements, the music, the action, the voice and the images, that you, as an audience member, you knew where the audience gaze was supposed to be. That was absolutely critical for me, to get that movement from one to the other so that you weren't going, oh God, it's too much like hard work. So that fusion was my main aim.
Great, David.
So, as someone who observed the composition of the poems originally at close quarters and various decisions that got made around that, I'm really interested in the way the language now holds its place on the stage. That's remarkable to me. And also, when the first line was sung, my first thought was, Nancy's words are being sung by somebody else, because the poems have a lyric quality, and so what one is hearing is a voice kind of speaking to itself, maybe to a reader, and suddenly they have a dramatic quality. And what I'd like to explore, if the chance arises, is how lyric writing has become dramatic writing, because it's very powerful in that respect.
Yes, as someone who works on drama and not poetry, I was really struck, having read it on the way up, by that shift. I you know, who don't know the poems at all except having read them on the way up, I was fascinated by them suddenly being impersonated and what that did to them.
It's really interesting.
And also something that came across very strongly from watching it was the relationship between the road and the river, which I was quite surprised about, that I hadn't noticed as I was reading. And I suppose a lot of that was to do with colour, and I thought the colour was quite a striking, going across the music and the words, and also the set was very interesting.
Wow, it's amazing hearing these responses. Actually, I'm thinking back to my funding applications and saying what I promised we'd claim and do when we deliver. And this is great. I wish I'd known this before. I mean, it's a slight disadvantage because I'm actually the only person in the room who's not seen this because I'm in it, and I still have not seen it because I'm not allowed to sit there on stage staring around. So I know what I wanted to achieve with it, and I think that'll come out in the questions later. So my main, I suppose, observations and sort of moments of wonder are to do with the score and the music, which Nicola knows. There are scenes in that which I just think are absolutely fantastic. I love the river scene, the lullaby scene. I just think the way she uses the instruments is everything I'd hoped for because I've known Nicola's music and more. So I suppose my immediate comments are more to do with that, and the other things are things I want to know rather than able to comment on because I've not seen it.
Well, I suppose my focus is probably slightly different today because up till now I've been a member of the music team taking notes, you know, listening, staying for the balances around the orchestra. So today I was seeing it very much more as perhaps more like where I started the project, where very much as Caroline said, my concern was ways of telling a story, and I didn't want a straight linear way, ways of moving in time. And all the time I was composing, what I was most concerned with was not just the relationship of word and music, but of visual image. And I was composing transformations in the music which matched the transformations in and so on and so on. And it was there were two things that were very interesting to me today. One was that I thought Caroline's work with the mime was absolutely fantastic because it knitted all the elements together. And although, I mean, the mime had been my idea originally, but I certainly hadn't written into the score everything the mime was to do. I knew there would be a mime or dancer in the piece. I knew that was essential. But the way Caroline realised it, I thought was fantastic. And everyone I talked to afterwards, it seemed to have worked, that holding this together. And the other thing, which was, I mean, it's of interest to me because composition is is usually rather finite, but in theatre one is often devising, and I mean technically devised theatre obviously is another thing altogether, but a piece evolves all the time, and sometimes that can be quite hard in opera because of just the mechanisms of scores and parts and everything. But because the piece is growing and changing, it was very interesting to me that, for example, tonight, the images were constant, whereas we had always imagined that they would fade out and be nothing in between. And the funny thing is that everyone came after us and said, "I really like the images being constant," because it made them watch the performers more.
Yes. Yeah.
It was really interesting. And of course, the great fear for myself and for Caroline was that as soon as you put an image, then the performers have to work so hard to get the audience's attention back onto them. But because there was always something on the screen, and because our singers and mine were holding their attention, it worked like that. So that was very interesting.
How interesting. Yeah, Nancy.
Well, it's been...
midnight call.
Yeah.
It was a midnight decision.
Yeah.
I guess it's been 2 years since we first met to discuss the idea, and when I first started out, because this is the first time I've ever written a libretto, I thought they were two completely different art forms, the poem and music, and the image and dance and all these things. But as it's grown, I see that they're not so different after all, and and that's been a revelation to me. And the thing that I think terrified me about it in the first place was turning something for me, which was more based on image and metaphor and implicitness, into something that was going to be explicit with a particular line of narrative, linear narrative. And what I've learned is it doesn't have to be. It doesn't. There can be a narrative element, but it doesn't have to be linear. That it can be expressed in other ways. And this is how it gets from the page to the stage, which is really the genius of these two people. That how that's happened. And so I guess it comes back to that point David mentioned about how lyric writing becomes dramatic. It's that process that's really, really interesting now.
And we can pick that up later, as we come to it. Kat?
Well, I was kind of interested in that. So, having been someone who's sort of heard Nancy read these poems and been involved in that in a much less intense way than David, just kind of listening to them, what I would sort of first take my attention and what sort of interested me was the way in which those words went from poem into the thing. And I was kind of thinking about that in terms that kind of connect with what other people were saying about kind of space and structure and sort of narrative or dramatic and lyric, and the way in which the narrative was very clear, but at the same time kind of you're talking about sort of musical spaces opening out, and I was more thinking that in terms of sort of lyric spaces opening out, sort of particularly that river scene where the words actually became kind of disembodied, even though they were kind of being spoken through sort of physical people who were in front of you. And you were saying about the images being there the whole time, and for me that really worked because the whole sort of the way in which the thing actually works is a sort of narrative through a series of still images. So having the image there the entire time kind of opened that up into ways of thinking about how the opera was sort of opening up and stilling, and the way in which the image was doing it too.
Yes. No.
I guess what interested me kind of relates to that. I was very interested in the way that it allowed for the poetry to have a kind of legacy beyond the textual. So whether it's sort of the marrying together of various different forms, the images and the music and the action, the drama, it takes it from the page. I was very interested in, I guess it relates to what David was saying about the lyric becoming dramatic. But I found that very interesting.
Yes. Yuhan?
Yeah, I guess the problem with being so far at the bottom end of the circle is that by the time you get this, I feel like all I'm going to do is just kind of echo out what everyone else already says. And that's exactly what I'm going to do. Because like so many others, I was really interested in the kind of the process of transformation, because like has already been said, I've seen Nancy read these poems and kind of read them in their original context, and kind of getting that transformation from textual into something that's performed and physical is a really interesting kind of process to observe or kind of see those little pit stops in that. But what was really interesting to me about it, in some senses, was the word that's already kind of floated about the table, which was fusion, in the sense. And what I was really struck by in terms of the fusion, whether we're talking about the fusion in terms of the lyric word becoming a dramatic word, or whether we're thinking about in terms of the music, or in terms of the physicality of the movement or the kind of projected images. What I was really struck by in terms of those elements of fusion was how fluid it all was, in the sense that going from the kind of costume changes, little minor costume changes happening on stage, and kind of a lot of the characters and kind of performers being on stage the whole time, and kind of having that movement happening fluidly. There's a kind of a seamless way, there's a kind of these multifarious connectivities of that fusion seem to be kind of happening at different levels, but there's a real kind of coming together in a like a fluid and seamless sort of way that I found a really interesting thing to kind of observe, having seen it in one context some years ago and then kind of encountering it and feeling entirely kind of different but familiar at the same time. So I think that fluidity of the fusion was the kind of the overarching thing that had an effect on me, I think.
I think as a facilitator, I'm not actually supposed to participate massively in it, but it's really going to be impossible for me to just not say a few things. And I mean, like you, I feel as if I'm echoing a lot. And the things that struck me in particular were notions of transformation. Yes, the sort of text to stage, page to stage, but also the actual transformations that were going on, say, across time, and that sort of stillness and movement and what that captured there. And also the other thing, and the sort of second thing which struck me, which I was completely unprepared for, and I kind of should have been prepared for it, but I was very struck by it, was something that I am used to reading in a seamless fashion, in one voice, as David was talking about, the kind of voice in your head on the page, suddenly going into several different voices, actual voices, so sort of different pitch, different timbre, different speed, different kind of expression, completely unpeeled the work, the poetry, in a way which I kind of, as I say, felt I should have been prepared for, but I wasn't. And it was so interesting to enter the work in a different manner, just through the sort of polyphonic, just the different voices, the actual sounds of the voices. So, what do we do next? Sorry, back to facilitator. Different hat. So it, in a kind of summing up of that step, in a sense, there's a lot of different views, but also they're crisscrossing clearly across different media and different disciplines. And also different sorts of spaces, some quite specific, some quite abstract. The next thing to sort of move to, if we can, is actually to swing attention really to the makers, and ask them to share with us thoughts they have about what you've made, but also perhaps what you wanted to do. To just open those out to us. And I mean, it's quite interesting, because I'm not sure I solved that for you.
No, I don't.
I do feel as if when I was watching that I was certainly moving between and around all the time. So I was quite taken aback, say, by the sort of, taken aback, but also simultaneously relieved, say, by the Asian appearing mime, for instance. And I sort of thought, now that's a choice which has been made, but maybe it wasn't a choice that was made, and maybe it was just, so I found myself really moving around in here of where am I, and am I one place or another? I think I ended up using the space as another kind of cultural place, so and not as a specific place. David?
I don't know if this is the right answer, but you said Western, Japanese or other, and I want to echo that. I want to say other, because what I found really affecting was the sense of journey and the sense of pilgrimage and the sense of hardship on journey and event on journey and the temporality of that. And obviously there they're universals. So it was that really captivated. Not that you couldn't be unaware of the cultural intersection, but what spoke most clearly were that set of elements.
The universal themes.
Yeah, and I wouldn't want to go straight to saying universal themes. I would just want to pick out those elements that really spoke. That's what I want to do.
Yes.
Yeah, it was the sort of the feeling of the connection with the human story.
Yeah, I agree.
Because by extension, the question would be that you would have cast Japanese-looking, an entirely Japanese-looking cast, and that did not matter. Well, at least certainly not to me. It didn't matter for one moment. I was captivated by the human stories expressed through the staging, through the music, through the text.
I'm not disagreeing with that at all, but
Well,
to
that's
echo,
fine,
no,
you can do so.
to echo what you said at the beginning, there were moments, particularly at the beginning, where I was trying to find my identity bearings, you know, is it Japanese? What's it? And doing all this kind of thinking, and then I let that go. And I let it go very early on and reached a different place. I don't want to call it, you know, human or what have you, because I'm a bit worried by terms like that. But I reached a different place. And yet, some of the most moving moments, there was, I was responding very emotionally, for example, to the lullaby, which to my, I keep apologising for not knowing much about music, but it seemed more Western, slightly.
Yes, the irony is it's actually a Japanese lullaby.
And that's exactly what I was going to say. At first I was thinking, am I responding to this because it's in my tradition? I thought, no, this is different. And it took me precisely to that other place beyond Western Japanese, and the lullaby.
The thing is, it's a 19th century Japanese lullaby. And most people, if you say Japanese music, they think of traditional music from, you know, the court of Japan 1,000 years ago.
Yeah, but there's a whole much longer tradition.
The melody that you chose, which do you know which year it was composed? Because it's all to do with the Meiji succession, because the Hiroshige prints of 1830.
That's right.
Yeah,
Well, it was your Japanese friend who gave me the tune, wasn't it?
We have a sort of person who was consulting us.
That's right.
And
She
she
said
she recommended this one as being around that time,
Yeah.
Hiroshige's time.
Yeah.
I could check with her to find out what that
It was
date
certainly
Yeah.
right for his lifetime,
Yeah.
that we know.
Yeah.
David? Or was that just like a...
No. If there's a culturally specific affect for me was the. Oh wait, to this.
Hold your thought.
The thing that always fascinates me is that the way we understand music, visual image, a poem, these things occupy completely different kinds of time. Music is a temporal language, like film is, say. But looking at a picture on the wall, we appreciate in a different time, obviously, to film. You know, our eye can travel back and forth across it. We can go into detail, all that. When I read a poem, again, I can go for the wholeness of it, I can go back, I can go forward. And in music, we listen in a completely different way. And whether we're a layperson or a trained musician, nevertheless, the way music unfolds for us in time means that when, as a composer, I'm working with words, all the time I'm dealing with this apparent paradox about time. So, I mean, that's one thing that's very important to me and maybe of interest to people who, from the literary side, to think about. The other thing I should say is that when I'm composing an opera, and I've done a lot of opera, though this is actually what I call a music theatre work, it's not a conventional opera, I like to either shape a libretto myself or to work with a librettist shaping it. And I always visualise the dramatic action very, very closely. That doesn't mean that I expect the director to follow it, not at all, because what is very exciting is when you hand a work to a director. It means that I know that it can work dramatically. I know that little things, I mean, I will pace across the room to find how long it takes. You know, all those kind of things. I see it very clearly in my mind's eye, and not immediately. I mean, in the same way, because sometimes take a month to find the right harmony, and then another time it comes so quickly, it comes in an hour. So with the dramatic, you know, I may spend a long time thinking, how will that scene work dramatically? How will I pace it dramatically before I get to the music and while I'm imagining the music? But it's definitely not a prescriptive thing. It's not to say then it's to be directed like that. It's to know that this piece will actually work in the theatre. And that's what fascinates me about the medium of opera. operates is a hybrid, and this is even more of a hybrid because it has spoken text as well as sung, and they're very different again in their pacing. A sung text takes about 3 times as long in terms of signification as a spoken one. And then obviously working with the visual element as well. I did a lot of work on, I tended to associate the movement of the image with the show instrument. Not always, obviously, but quite often there were moments of transformation where, again, I had all pictures, obviously, and spent a long time looking at them, and I would telephone Nancy and say, do you think it would be better if we used that image instead of this one, because the musical colour of that, etc. That's the kind of dialogue that was going on. I mean, that's a rather long answer, but it gives you some idea of the sort of issues that fascinate me about this medium, this hybrid medium.
And do you have a curiosity about how that will have struck others, or is it something that you're not concerned with when you're doing it? So we're all audience members here, except Kate.
Well, yes and no. I mean, when I was at the beginning of my career, student just after, I worked in the theatre quite a lot, and so it's strange. In one way, you're always aware of the audience because what you're doing is about communication, it's about storytelling. But you're not. I'm never concerned when I'm writing as whether the audience will like it or not.
Yeah.
That's not the point.
Yeah.
I mean, the first audience anyway are the singers and the musicians and the people who are making the work. The work doesn't come to life till it's with them. So in one way, I don't think about the audience at all. But in another way, it's there from the beginning because if you aren't telling the story, if you aren't engaging them in the very first moments, I mean, getting first sounds right. I mean, Paul, wonderful because he's composer, picked up on what I did in the first bars, which I don't think most people did, which was that I used Western instruments to play Japanese harmony. And that was a particular kind of fusion which would open a door orally. But that's just one thing.
Okay, thank you. I suspect we may circle back to some of what you're saying, in particular to do things like how time is managed, because it's something which has now come up several times, transformation and time. And the notion, of course, that the first audience are the performers, and it's just a completely different way of thinking about it. Caroline, did you want to add something?
Yeah, I do. I think from what Nicola was saying, for me as a director, I'm a performer as well, in physical theatre as well as and I direct opera and straight theatre. And particularly for myself, for me, the voice is of the body, the whole body. And that's how we should tell stories. When we communicate, there's non-verbal language going on. 55% of communication is non-verbal. So you can stand somebody on stage and they can tell a story before they open their mouth. 70% is what you say. 30-odd% is how you say it. So all the colours, so that's what I always start with. But I always start with visual images in my head before I think, oh, they're going 20 stages left and right. So I have this kind of picture and this colour palette. So what was great about this project was having the images to guide my blocking, if you like. The blocking is, what happens on stage. But particularly as well, having a fabulous privilege, really, to collaborate with Nicola before there was a note written, which is very rare for a director. So you feel like that you are in the piece from the very beginning. And so what I try to do for an audience is actually hold out my hand and say, come into this piece with me. Because I've done 15, 20 years worth of site-specific work before it was called site-specific. And in muddy fields and all sorts of places. And I want to take the audience on a journey so that they can forget that they're sitting in a red velvet seat or, usually I have people standing in a field. But it's to take them on that journey out of themselves. So for me to be inside the music before the music had even been written, from the visual, and then me given the sound world, was quite a unique opportunity. And then the added luxury of having the amazing instruments, most of them that I didn't know what they were called before I saw them. And then what can we do with that? So yeah, it's very much voices of the body, whether it's spoken as an actor or whether it's sung. To me, it's got to be physicalised. So then the challenge of working with singers who are perhaps not of the same mindset is So then having, for me, the mime, the poet, was always the conduit. They were the suture through this piece. Absolutely essential, and that's why, coming from the audience, come with us on this journey, and then we'll take you away back to the 2014. You know, she's stepping into that river. So again, crucial for me was the moments of transformation, and I kept saying in rehearsals, this is the moment in this particular bar of transformation, physically, but first starting with the physical, visual, physical, some kind of. But you've got to see that, and that's then the audience gaze at that moment, because Nicola had written it so particularly, which is just a gift, because a new piece is really tricky, because you've got no template to work from, and the singers are going, I can't go and stick Traviata on and listen to Fortnite. Who are these people? You know, this is your creation, so it's very nerve-wracking for the performer on a new piece. But it was just lovely to collaborate with those multi-aspects, and I love doing that, taking people that don't normally work together. It's great. Dive in.
Paul, did you have something?
I wanted to ask Nicola, I was wanting to ask Nicola something which I thought, since we were talking about the way the poetry had been enlivened by the music, because Nicola, you made lots of different choices about which voices were going to be with which instruments. So sometimes you had trios, sometimes you had duos, sometimes you had larger ensembles. Could you unpack that a little bit for everybody? Because I think that's one of the other interesting things about the way that these poems have been released in a different sort of way.
We will do that now because you've got to go. So that's that's fine. Yeah.
Just before Caroline goes, in that case, I'd just like to say one thing that was incredibly lucky for me about this project was that I asked Kate if I could could I have Caroline Clay? Please could I have Dominic? please could I have Dominic Wheeler? And she contacted them both and they were free. And this is fantastic because, as Caroline says, to work with a director before you make the piece is fantastic for a composer. It's hugely helpful. It stimulates all the imagination. Yeah.
So sorry
You
about to
must
go.
go. Thank you.
First World War with us. Great, thank you very much.
Thank you.
But to answer Paul's question, I always do far more research for a project than it's actually, you might think, necessary. Why would a composer need to know the history of 19th century Japan? But it just is all part of the getting into the project. And so I was endlessly asking Nancy questions and getting, reading more about Hiroshige and asking her for more reading lists and so on. And I knew that on this journey, because the military government wouldn't let bridges be built over the rivers because they wanted to keep everyone in their place, it was an iron fist kind of military government, that I understood why Nancy's poems, the rivers were always coming up. And one of the first things I remember saying to you is, this is a road, but they're always talking about the rivers. It's obvious why Nancy's poems focus on the river, because the images focus on the river. And so in all my early imaginings of the piece, and very early on I knew things like I wanted Hiroshige to be speaking text as well as singing, because it was essential to me that some of the poetry was heard as speech. Because, however good singers' dictionaries, you're never going to hear all the words. If it was all sung, you'd lose some of the poetry. So that was something I'd heard very early on. But equally, I knew I wanted a voice of the river. I wanted to personify the river musically. And so therefore I had to take my singers out of their characters. So they had to have a different kind of vocal style. They all, you saw they all sang together. And the river music is in the orchestra, which has got all the cross currents and so on. Yeah. But as to whether I associated an oboe with somebody or a clarinet with someone, that was a slightly later decision. The decision that Hiroshige would be associated with the koto was a very early decision, because that is such an expressive Japanese instrument in a way that the show isn't. And he is the main character. So the main Japanese sound world of the koto needed for me to be with the main Hiroshige character, who is the focus of the whole work. So that was an early decision.
So that came straight after the prologue. It comes in the prologue, doesn't it?
It
comes at the point when he goes from the present into the past.
It comes even earlier than that. It comes when he begins to identify himself in singing as the man who is painting this picture you're looking at.
That's what
Yeah, I loved that book. Okay, thank you. I think what I'll do then is move to Nancy, if you don't mind, and then Kate, I'll be as sort of oversight and
then I think, excuse me, I have to go.
Yes, of course.
Yeah.
Of course, Nancy.
I just want to echo what both Caroline and Nicola have said about collaboration, because, it was a revelation to me when I found out that I would be doing this that the libretto comes first. Somehow I imagined it would be the other way around. So I thought, well, how does one, sort of start to write a piece for, music, for an opera, when, you don't know exactly what it is you're writing for. So, there were 7 drafts in the end.
Over what, about a year?
Over, about a year.
Yeah.
But each one got better and better, and it was through collaboration.
Yeah, I went to stay with Nancy, or she came to stay with me, it was
absolutely crucial. And at one of those meetings, Caroline was present, and that was the first time I met her in York. And I always remembered, her words were, this is very nice. It's very pretty. I think that was draft 5. She said, but don't you want it to be something a little bit more than just pretty? And I thought, yeah, I do want it to be more than just pretty. And that was, I always sort of kept that in the back of my mind. And so that's where this kind of notion of the artist Hiroshige, sort of as a witness, that art bears witness.
Yeah.
And in fact, it is a fact of biography.
Yeah.
So that was a key crucial. That was a breakthrough, wasn't
Yes,
it? When and so after that, But I guess if I were to ask a question, it would be of this audience would be, does that sort of message come across? And if it does come across, hopefully not in too heavy-handed a way, but does it come across?
And what message again, Nancy?
About the notion of art, sort of bearing witness.
He saw this landscape, he saw people who were starving, he saw people who were wealthy, poor, whatever, all travelling together, and his pictures could tell the story and bear witness to what was going on in a closed country, which...
And shall I open that out for a minute and then see what others might have to sort of respond to that, and to Nancy's question? Is the work, do we understand the work partly through the way Hiroshige seems to bear witness? Anna, no problem.
I was going to jump in because I'm very conscious that I'm one of the few people who came to this absolutely cold.
Yes.
I mean, I've not read a word of your poetry or anything like this, and so my resounding answer is yes. But I also felt that there was another, and I mentioned this in my opening comment, I am the traveller because of that road, and the sense that the self is created, his self, ourselves are created by the road, and that I am the traveller because of that road. You were talking about breaking down the kind of linear arc of the story. So we're travelling with him, but we're travelling backwards, forwards in time, and that, I'm not explaining this very well, but it sort of ties in with this idea of bearing witness to the past.
Yeah.
The past is in the present is in your work, and somehow that I found very moving, actually, and it certainly did come across. And I'm not at all visual, and yet it helped me having those images there all the time to attend to the visual and get beyond the words, because I'm very wordy, as you can tell.
I just remembered something, Nancy, which, as Nancy said, over a year we had, 7 drafts. And I don't remember at what point, maybe between draft 2 and 3, or 1 and 2, in the researching Hiroshige, I came across this amazing print, which you saw this afternoon, of what is apparently a historical landscape with snow on it. And when you look closely, everything is a skull or a skeleton.
I thought that was amazing.
And when I saw that, that was an absolute eureka moment. I knew that although that is not one of the series of Takaido Road, and therefore was not in the original book of poems, I knew that it was going to be a focus in the opera. That was when I understood the way in which I wanted the bearing witness, the power of art to bear witness.
To be captured. Kat, did you also say then, Paul, you also mentioned?
Well, to answer Nancy's question quite briefly, yes, but I wanted to sort of respond with a question, which would be that it sounds kind of like you're saying that was a change that kind of occurred from the poetry collection to the opera, and whether there was something in those formats that meant certain things were kind of required for the opera, that the poetry had a kind of different logic to it.
That is actually quite an interesting question. I think, in a way, that idea was in the poems themselves. however, not necessarily attached to Hiroshige as a character.
Yeah.
So that would be the difference. So yeah,
Yeah.
But attached to who in the poems?
Well,
Yes, this is-
well, it's attaching to really to the writer.
Yes,
Yeah.
that's what I was.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's what I was wondering. So it's it's a process of
Yeah.
sort of detachment and,
Yeah, yeah.
and housing it elsewhere.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
So
very
can-
very interesting.
Can I ask you, did writing the libretto disclose anything about the poems that you hadn't appreciated prior to writing the libretto?
Yeah, it did indeed, because I realized that there was a very much stronger narrative element than I had ever imagined was there, not in individual poems, but taken as a whole. That also that the characters were very real, in fact, you know, not just ornaments, but in fact, you know, they were real characters already in the poems. That was a surprise, I think. Yeah.
Paul, did you have something to say?
I was just going. It was to do with the what you were talking about bearing witness. And again, maybe I would say yes from that. I was interested in what you said about that you had a different view of what the images were going to do, because by having the image static projection, it gave two things. One meant we weren't just distracted by looking at it if you didn't want to. But the other thing is that when you were seeing the action in front, it gave a reference point. So if there was something that you rather banally didn't understand in the gesture, you could always refer it back to the finger. So there was always that sort of reference point. But the other thing it did is when you had the movement in the mime and the poems themselves, that then meant that you were rereading that poem. So, for example, that scene, as you said, with Steve the skulls. No, I didn't see the skull straight away. But as things were going on, yes, I did. And that was a very interesting sort of reading. And there was also other things on some of the other prints. I mean, some of those prints I got the feeling that sort of, I didn't know these prints very well, but I'd seen some of them. But there's a number of them I didn't know at all. And that was really quite interesting. And then that you were sort of led into that. The other thing about the witness, which I think is really interesting, which is just the sort of plot of it, is the way that the encounters with the two women in the first time and the second time, and that both of those go in different directions. He's sort of touching them and then going away and then touching again, but their lives can go in different ways. And I think your aspect of bearing witness comes from that as well, very, very clearly, that he's got this aspect of him, he's wanting to just bear witness, but he can't help the fact that he's actually involved. And that and also that he motivates things, he motivates people's actions.
And then that kind of ties back to Nicola, kind of what you were saying about experiencing different sort of genres in different sort of temporal ways, and what happens when you kind of bring them together.
Fascinating. Nancy, did you have anything else you wanted to ask at the minute?
No, I think maybe we should go to Kate.
Yes?
Oh, I have two burning issues. They're probably slightly more crude actually than the sophisticated ideas going around. But when I first started thinking about this, there were two issues for me that I really wanted to explore. One was that Okeanos have existed as an ensemble of Western and Japanese instruments for about 10 years. And I really thought it was time we kind of worked out what our relationship was with this other culture. I'm probably the least authentic person in the group. I've never even been to Japan. I don't play a Japanese instrument. I'm fascinated by the culture, but everything I know is through books and through pictures and through talking to people. And I think my own relationship with Japan is a very much sort of as a tourist, because I'm fascinated by the differences, the similarities, and like visiting a place, and I'm kind of been happy to go along with that and take that into this project. But I suppose a very crude question, which I'd be quite interested in the responses to, is when you see something like that, do you feel you're watching something Western, something Japanese, or something else? I'm really curious to know how something like that comes across, where two cultures are clearly present, but what does it look like to an audience?
Yes.
What were you seeing? It's a bit of a clumsy question. I'm sorry, but question.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Images are not unknown. In fact, they're well known.
Yeah.
And so the effect of seeing the images there with the music drew out specifics, kind of specifics to Japanese culture that I have not noticed in just gazing at the images in books or across the internet. So they kind of there is something occurs culturally specifically that is very resonant, I think.
I'm quite relieved everyone is saying other rather than West, because I don't think we would have failed if everyone had said, oh, it's clearly Western with just a few Japanese things chucked in. But the last thing we would want to do is set ourselves up to be Japanese, because we're not, and it would be wrong. And so I've always been quite comfortable with this kind of other space, wherever it is, where you say it's okay not to know these things, it's okay to be fascinated by these differences and these similarities, and it's something I'm quite comfortable with. But I just wonder whether that was something that other people were comfortable with, or it jarred, or it felt uncomfortable, or like you say, it took maybe a little while to find your place in it, but once you let go,
that's actually part of, I think, for my money, that's actually part of finding the otherness. You must be unsettled first, otherwise you don't go there.
Yeah, that's kind of a main thematic of the poems as well, isn't it? Like your kind of encounter with these.
That's right.
Yes, as a tourist, almost. As a visitor, these fascinate me, and this is my reading of it. And I suppose we just took that further, didn't we? Really,
And besides, discomfort can be about because something matters, rather than just something where you're going to sort of take it for granted or settle into some sort of complacency.
Know exactly what you're doing. Yeah. Did you have a second?
I did, if you don't mind. It's sort of connected to this. It probably leads on to it. The other thing is that Okeanos have always collaborated with other art forms, and for this, for me, Takaido Road was a sort of framework in which to put quite a bold number of art forms in one place. We have the poetry, we have storytelling, we have a mime, we have the art, we have contemporary photography, we have the music. It's a 60-minute framework in which to put a lot of art forms, and the word that Nancy shared with me that changed everything was this notion of ekphrasis, where one art form comments on another. And I was really pleased to hear what you were saying earlier, Paul, about how, if you were watching the mime or listening to the poetry, that illustrated something in the picture or made you notice something, which is exactly what we were after. The word that came up a few times earlier, the one I'm a little bit uncomfortable with, is this fusion notion, because to me that's always it's a mushy place which is not distinct. I'm never quite sure what it's meant, except that if you say you're a fusion group, you get the kind of 2 a.m. slot that nobody comes to. So it can be quite an unhelpful term. But I think we were very keen to keep the elements very distinct and very, very not sort of smudged together, and allow everything space to comment on each other and try and illustrate it. So again, it's a sort of evaluation question to what extent did that succeed, and did you notice that happening, and should you have noticed it, or was it just a wash of sort of enlightenment? Did they work together, or didn't they? Or did anything jar? Was that too much in there?
I was going to say at the beginning. Sorry, I whiffed again. At the beginning, when we were talking about settling in, when it was a contemporary photography, that was, I think, the thing which I thought was the most discomfort. Deliberately so, I believe, because you were setting up. This is how does a contemporary world we're trying to discover from here where the thing is, where the original poems are, and it's very, very difficult to see. And of course, what's really interesting, of course, when you look at those images, the contemporary and the ones that comes after, you've got no idea what they've got to do with one another. And by the time you get to the last image, with the bridge and the modern bridge, then perhaps it's a bit closer together.
Okay.
But there again, and I was thinking back in my mind, thinking, well, yes, but if you look at London Bridge and you look at the engravings of London Bridge in the 16th century, they're nothing like what there is. So the landscape is very different, aside from a few things on the river banks. So to expect that you'll see something recognisable first looking, it's just ridiculous. You wouldn't. I think the only thing I would have sort of felt, if you wanted to contextualise that slightly better, would be to have a contemporary shot which did have Mount Fuji in it. At least you could orientate yourself that way. But I don't think you needed it. It was something that I felt about photography I would like to see. But I don't think you needed it in the work. And in actual fact, if you did do it, it would have to happen in the middle, and then it would completely disrupt the narrative. It wouldn't make no sense.
The images have been the hardest thing to reconcile like that, especially the old and the new. That's been the biggest set of conversations, hasn't it? And the most difficult part of it, without a
Replacing them
doubt.
even a few days ago.
Yes, even like right up to just very recently, taking out more of the modern ones and putting, just getting the balance and stuff.
I think that was a very good balance in the end.
Do you?
But because it did that framing effect, it did really make
Yes.
actually you're a modern person thinking back to what was.
Yeah, yeah. Okay.
Could I ask, it's quite interesting that one of the most disturbing aspects of the opera is the way that the earthquake and the tsunami affect Kikuyu, which is such a commentary on recent events. I mean, it's a very powerful moment that where she's. I mean, I'm just playing. I can just see all this movement going on.
Please don't ask me a question about the pictures.
I know
something
something disturbing is going on stage. I know that, but the emotion I mean, especially when she has the premonition, every time she sings that, I can just feel this tightness in my chest. It's just this awful. Something is going to happen to her. She knows something is going to happen to her. It just gets me every time. That's how powerful, especially being so close to a singer when she hit those high B flats, high B natural. Amazing.
I think that's where I stopped noticing the imagery so much, because there's so much power in the music and the words there that it took me a long time to catch up with the images and think, because I could see I could feel what's happening.
Really good point. That what happened to me as well. I didn't realise that.
Yeah.
I actually, I stopped registering the images for a whole long period of time, and I don't necessarily feel that was necessarily a loss, but sort of what you were saying, Paul, about sort of illustrating. So if I found myself ever so slightly at sea, I would look elsewhere and think, yes, this is what's happening now, or whatever. So I did sort of look to the images for that. But I did the same thing. I didn't realise it until you said it. That is what I did. I looked in the big drama in the middle, when she's all the river and also when she's going and all of that. I was completely swept up in that, and I couldn't tell you what was going on there. David and then Paul.
I don't want to put him on the spot, but I've got a question for you, Har, if that's okay. Which is, I just wonder what you, as a student of performance, but especially as a student of the happening, I wondered what you thought about the question of the way that the elements related to one another.
The way in which the elements
related to one another.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think in some senses the kind of level of sort of thinking about the fusion as a kind of, in a sense of being a sort of a smudged area, like you were kind of talking about being kind of concerned about fusion as a kind of a smudged thing, that I think it's not necessarily in that kind, that you think about them as a kind of melding in a smudged sort of messy kind of way, isn't something that kind of happened. That wasn't the way I experienced it. I thought that there was a kind of way in which what these particular different sections, whether we're looking at the kind of visual projections or whether we're looking at the kind of movements and the singing and the kind of music, is that they're all kind of, it's more about a kind of dialogue or a kind of conversation or a kind of, I guess they kind of what they do together. So they're separate kind of points, as if you're looking at things, different points in a space kind of merging together into kind of just the nexus of the experience of it. So it's not necessarily kind of a smudged coming together of things, but while they kind of all have their distinct character and role, but what happens in observing them all in kind of unison in that same space is that they kind of generate this very kind of complex nexus that kind of happens in different sort of levels where they are all kind of working together as different kind of intonations or as different kind of articulations of a particular kind of experience. So what that kind of sense of lostness that I think people have spoken about is a kind of sort of in-betweenness that goes back to that idea of everyone saying other as opposed to, Western or Japanese. It's that kind of level of being an in-betweenness, which actually I think is at the heart of the event itself in the performance. I mean, it goes from the what I've now learned in the opening music, where it's Western instruments playing Japanese harmonies. There's that kind of in-betweenness being generated. The whole concept of a journey itself is a kind of liminal in-between space. And what those different kind of constituted parts end up doing in that kind of nexus of experience is kind of, they end up conveying that sense of in-betweenness. So those kind of experiences that we've all been talking about, I think, are just kind of different ways of articulating that. Okay. I think I'll stop there.
That's a question worth asking, David.
I think it would be just fascinating to go and see it again and see if you have.
Yes.
I want to see it.
I want to see it again, exactly.
Oh,
I find exactly the
Yeah.
same. Fortunately, it's coming in next year, but I had exactly the same response. Kat, did
I
you?
was just thinking about it because when you were talking about sort of fusion and muddiness, I was trying to think about it in terms of like, is what you wanted like more of a collage where you have sort of quite disparate elements and sort of the energy is kind of around how they kind of rub together. But then I kind of thought it wasn't exactly because you didn't want these elements to be disparate, but still what was occurring was often something you were talking about. This is space kind of created between the two and how they were talking to each other, with those elements sort of being more sympathetic than you would have in sort of an idea of collage.
Yeah, I love this idea that we've got this sort of space that's not entirely defined, but everyone seems quite comfortable with it. I really like that. I like living in slightly grey areas where you know. I think that's great. I'm really pleased with that. That's fantastic.
Well, let's shift over for just a few minutes then in this sort of, and we've done a bit of it anyway, but I just want to sweep up in case there, and we've asked a few questions as we've gone along, but there are a couple of things we haven't really touched on much, which we might be able to look at a little bit, which is the sort of movement from the lyrical to the dramatic, that sort of movement from text, and we've touched on that in terms of collaboration. But are there other questions that audience members sort of have of makers, even though our makers are swiftly disappearing, that we might want to say? Thank you, Kat.
Oh, there was something that I was wanted to say beforehand about the images.
Yes.
Because my memory of that section where she's been swept away is two images. One of the premonition, which is the blue spiral of the water, and then the second one, which is almost looks like a harbour scene, which looks completely conventional, except for this sort of mountain which comes in the middle, which you suddenly realise is actually a tsunami wave.
Yes. I remember the way.
And I think that's the only two images I remember.
Yeah.
Is there anything else?
Yeah, well, it's really interesting that this has come up because I mentioned that, you know, as early as as late as 2 or 3 days ago, we were still changing images, and in that scene we had a kind of tumbling effect of various disaster shots, historic images from Japan. And Caroline, you know, bless her, she made the absolutely right call, didn't she, to replace those images with the ones that you mentioned, which are actually Hiroshige images. So it's much simpler, less busy, and also it doesn't have that association with particularly the 1923 earthquake and things like that, which we didn't want. You know, we didn't want association with particular historic events, but a more general idea that, you know, Japan is constantly hit by disasters. You know, the world is constantly hit by these disasters now. So those images do that, and
It would have been too fussy on stage.
I think it would have been too fussy. I think you're right.
Yeah, interesting. That's really interesting
really,
to come out,
interesting.
isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah, Caroline would be delighted to hear it, but
Well,
perhaps
let's
not
make sure she
surprised.
hears it.
And also so that it becomes an internalised process for the audience as well. In the same way that, for example, if you're seeing sexual scenes, actually what tends to be much more erotic is if lots is left to your imagination, rather than it being hit in the face with, you know, here it is full front.
Literally, whilst at that point.
Well, yes.
It was. I did actually sort of think of there was enough there where I thought the children in the audience.
Let's just see them out.
Yes. Okay, it's very interesting to sort of note the shift over such a short period of time as well. And in fact, images, I suppose, are the thing that can do that kind of movement, can't they? So close to the performance date. Do other people have sort of questions or thoughts that are on your minds?
I've just got something. I'm just curious because the whole idea of dealing with the global warming issue started with the Kyoto summit. We do this journey where we see these natural disasters, as Nancy says, are becoming more and more recurring. And then we reach Kyoto and it's like, can we go back? Can we restore the inner harmony of the world? Can we resolve this? You know, it's really interesting. When I hear that lovely D major spread chord with the show, and we all join in, and he says Kyoto, and I thought it is possible. It is possible.
I've got a question for Nancy. So there's a story being told, and therefore there's a temporality at work. This goes back to Nicola's excellent question about time right at the beginning. I'm just wondering what the relation between the libretto has to stillness, because there's a wonderful line right at the end where you say that, where I can't remember who says it, but the line is something like, speaking a language in which there's no such word as loss.
Right.
So there's a sense of restoration there. The images themselves are very still. They have a real stillness about them. So I'm just wondering how stillness is part of the thinking of the language.
Yeah, well, stillness is always at the heart of that work. You know, from the very beginning, it was really important in the poems themselves. So I was really keen to make sure that was still a presence in this piece. And obviously a bit of a concern was the fact that it was 50 minutes or mostly an hour perhaps in length and duration, and with all of these things happening that would be lost, but it's not lost. And I think it's the music which sort of makes that possible. That I'm sorry, I'm not a musician, so I can't use the right terminology, but that kind of fading out to silence that often happened with the instruments, and the meditation bowl itself, which you listen until the sound disappears. That happens at several points, and the way instruments come in and then they fade into the background again. I just love that aspect of it. So I think I think it's still there.
More so. Even more so.
Really.
Yeah.
Yes, I was thinking also that the stillness is partly captured. It is also by the physical movement. I'm sorry that Caroline's gone. I think that that the singers were forever, and the mime were forever doing and stopping, or doing quite a lot and then going into themselves. And there was a great deal of that, and I thought that really accentuated the opening and closing, you were saying, of the music, but also of the poetry. That I thought that was very well timed. And my question for Caroline would have been, what was it like to work with so much movement with the singers? Because some of them are going to be sort of more keen than others, and how was that sort of transferred, and how was that worked with? Because it was very striking to me that the singers were very comfortable with movement, and quite dance music and dance movement actually, rather than the usual moving across the stage and a few up and downs.
She's very good at getting the message out. They don't all start from the same place. By the time she's finished with them, they can all move. Yeah, no, they all come with a different set of skills. In fact, when we cast, and Caroline was there on the panel. She was very interested to see how they move and how they respond. She likes malleable singers, friendly singers who will do it. It's important.
And she did spend the first few days, didn't she, just working on her own with the actors on physical, the physical movements. Yeah.
But that was so important to the movement of the piece and the storytelling. Other thoughts or questions before we wrap up? We're just about at the end, and some people have sat like this for 2 hours watching, warming up to the piece. So.
Nancy, when you wrote the text, did you ever conceive that it would become music?
Do you mean when I wrote the poems?
Yes. Sorry, the original poems.
No, I could have never imagined.
Did you write them with the speaking voice in mind, or as a reading it to yourself?
Well, certainly there are always voices. There are certain things like the voice of the river is in the poems, it's in italics, and the characters speak it's in a different font, in the poems. Yeah. So I'm it sounds a bit weird, I'm always hearing voices. Yeah. No, you know what I mean.
Yes.
Yeah, so the voices were there.
Yeah. And the music in the voices and in the words.
Yeah, and quite often I actually listen to music when I'm writing poetry, and I have a particularly favorite shakuhachi recording that I often listen to when I was recording these poems. So maybe there was some transfer that I'm not really conscious of.
more of a production question, really, which is to do with when things are in this, because this is going to be toured. And the question really is about lighting. And there were certain passages where I'm not a great lighting expert at all, but there were certain types of things which I thought really worked very well with the lighting, and they drew your attention to it. There are other bits that I wondered whether there might be a little bit of revisiting. The one that struck me, which I was less comfortable, was just right at the beginning, where the male singer collapses like an old man onto that. And that I wondered if there could be a different type of approach to suggest something more about his age or something about that. Because that was the bit about the movement and about the light and about the use of space, which wasn't as convincing as perhaps later on. But that was just me.
No, that's really good. I know they want to rejig it, and I think it's going to be one of those things where, because all the venues are different, they've all got different rigs. It'll always have to be slightly ad hoc at each one, to sort of work it out as we go. It's going to be sort of not ad hoc, it's bespoke production. It's completely, just edit that out, please. Bespoke production everywhere we go, and based on what we've got. But that's really, really useful. Actually.
Based on what we've got.
Based on what's there, what budget's remaining. But that's quite useful actually, because the lighting is going to be talked about again this week.
Yeah,
so.
I don't know, perhaps to me it just felt perhaps a little bit too soft. But it was actually tighter.
And it was which bit? Where he's an old man?
Right at the beginning
Right at the
piece,
beginning.
where he, to give the impression that he's an old man, he collapses down onto his knees.
Yeah, right at the very start. Yes, yeah.
Yeah, I found myself not quite sure what I was meant to be feeling at that point with the lighting.
And there's nothing else going on, of course, except him doing
Yes,
that.
that's
very kind of
but I couldn't
naked
have,
moment,
until
isn't
Paul
it?
said that, I couldn't have articulated what it was.
Yeah, but that's really
why.
why.
But I just, yes.
The background, the two ladies in the back with the lights on those, that was fine.
Yeah.
That was soft, that worked fine. It was the thing in the front.
Yeah, no, well, just about that. Thank you. That's the sort of thing we can do something about. That's fine. Keep all the other answers.
Okay, I think we shall wrap up, because we've actually, right at the beginning of this, I thought, oh my gosh, it's only been 7 minutes. How are we going to do this? But it's like a whole hour, folks.